Hello everyone. Can you hear me now? Hi guys. Is the audio fine now, or is it still not audible? Okay, so I got. Yeah, so I think it's fine now. Okay. Yeah, so I think we should begin. It's already quite late. Yeah. So the topic for today is isolated queen form. Just to confirm once again, if everyone can hear me fine. Uh, yeah. So is the audio fine now? No, there are no two coaches. I'll be the only coach today. So Kaushal and Lim won't be joining us. Yes, I think we should begin now. So the topic for today, as I already said, is isolated queen spawn. Yeah. So yeah, I'll be the only coach for today. There'll be no Kaushal and no Lim. Yeah. So the topic for today is isolated queen spawn. So before we begin, I think you need to know a little about the history of isolated queen spawn and also some of the basics about isolated queen spawn. So basically, isolated queen pawn structure is when one side has an isolated pawn on d4 or d5, for example, on the center of the board. Isolated because it can't be defended by the other pawns, and you could consider it kind of weak. Okay, so now for some basic history. Okay, so the audio is. Is it still not clear? Is it okay now? So is it still buzzing or is it fine now? I don't understand. Okay, so I think it's fine. Yeah, let's just continue. So, yeah, as I was saying, a little bit about the history of isolated queen pawn structure. So, this was basically first kind of discovered in the first significant games in the structure between the former world champion, the first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz, and Johannes Zukertort. So in which Steinitz basically pretty much demonstrated that the isolated queen's pawn is actually a weakness, and he won some nice games. So from that point onwards, people started considering the isolated queen's pawn as a weakness and avoiding it, and it wasn't really popular till the next world. I mean, till one of the best players of the time, Mikhail Botvinnik, started using it regularly, and then he basically showed everyone that it's not a weakness. It also has its own advantages, and it's just a position. So both sides have their own strengths and weaknesses, and it's basically just a position. It's not a weakness or a strength for either side. Yeah, and there are advantages and disadvantages to having an isolated queen's pawn. So basically, the advantages, let's say, of having an isolated queen's pawn are the side with the isolated queen's pawn usually has more space and good dynamic attacking chances because the pieces can be developed easily, and there's a lot of possibility for kingside attacks. And obviously, the weakness, which is quite apparent, is that the pawn is weak. It cannot be defended by any other pawn, and the only way to defend the pawn, and the only way to defend the pawn would be with the pieces. So the side who is defending usually tries to blockade the pawn, so that the side with the isolated pawn can't move it forwards. And yeah, they usually target the pawn which is weak or just blockade the pawn. These are two ways you can play against the isolated queen's pawn. Uh, yeah, and also the way you play with the isolated. Yeah, so I'm not yet moving any of the pieces. Just a basic explanation before we begin. Yeah, so the way you play with the isolated pawn is by trying to go for a kingside attack usually, or trying to push the pawn forwards when it's advantageous for you. Yeah, pawn forwards when it's advantageous for you. Yeah. So this time we're going to be looking at some of the games of the former world champion from Russia, Mikhail Botvinnik, who was probably the first person to demonstrate that the isolated queen's pawn is not actually weakness and completely playable. Okay, so the first game, yeah, on the first game he was on the losing side actually. This was his game against one more world champion, Max Server, who was playing black, and Botvinnik was white in this game. Yeah, so we're just going to see how black handles playing against the isolated queen's pawn, and basically it's very instructive. Okay, let's just begin. Yeah, yes. So it started out as an English opening, but this is now a Pano Botvinnik attack, and one of the most popular openings in which white gets an isolated queen's pawn. Let me just check one sec. Okay, is it still glitchy or is it okay now? Or is it fine or still glitchy? Yeah, so is it better now? I guess it's better. Yes, I'm getting mixed signals. Some of you are saying the audio is fine, and some of you are saying the audio is not okay. Okay, I think this is the best I can do for now. Let's just continue. Yeah. So this is basically the starting position for us to see how the isolated queen's pawn develops. Yeah, and so here black has a lot of options. So for example, taking, or he could play like a black did in the game, develop the pieces first. Let's see how Max Server handles it. Yeah. So just knight c6, developing your pieces, pretty natural. Bishop g5, and yeah, here black has a choice. He can either go for this capturing a pawn on c4 immediately and creating the isolated queen's pawn for black on d4. Or he can play what black did in the game, which was pawn to e6. Yeah. So the thing about pawn captures d4 is pawn captures c4 is white has this possibility of going d5 and knight e5 queen d4, which was thought to be really good for white, but soon it was found out that h6 is actually completely fine for black, and black is not really in any sort of trouble. So one more way for white to play this position would be to just take on c4, sacrifice a pawn on d4 for some attacking chances, some dynamic possibility. Taking on c4, he could decide to not even take on c4 at any point. Yeah. So black just plays normally again, knight to f3, developing his pieces. Pretty natural. And again, okay, what's wrong with the audio again? Is something wrong with the audio? Okay, that's maybe because it could be quiet when I'm not talking, probably. I don't know. Okay, let's just continue. Yeah. So okay. So black decides not to commit for the moment and just defends the pawn on d5 with e6. Yeah, and again white plays quite naturally with knight to f3. So here again black has a choice. He could go for bishop e7 or he could capture the pawn on c4. Yeah. So the problem with bishop e7 right now, even though this looks quite natural, is the move c. Now, white is just completely avoiding this isolated queen's pawn structure and changing his plans. So, for example, this and this. And yeah, white is even threatening to capture on c6 and put a knight on e5. And the isolated queen's pawn structure is completely out of the question right now. So this could be a little annoying for black. So that is why he decides to just change the structure completely and goes for this. Captures a pawn on c4, and obviously white recaptures. Yeah, and so here we arrive at the critical pawn structure, the isolated queen's pawn. So as you can see, white has a pawn on d4, which is obviously quite weak, cannot be defended by any other pawn, and is an easy soft target for black. But on the other hand, just look at white's pieces. All the pieces are placed quite ideally. The bishop on c4, the knight on c3, knight on f3, the bishop on g5. All of them are quite active, and white is ready to get castled, develop the queen, and get the rooks out. So both sides have the chances. So black is just going to play against the pawn on d4, and white is going to try and build an attack on the king side. So basically, the main ideas for black in these kind of positions, one is to blockade the square on d5. You don't want to allow white to play a move like d5, so you want to blockade the square on d5. One more idea is to put pressure on the d4 square. So these are the two ways in which black deals with the isolated queen's pawn. Yeah, putting pressure on the pawn and also blockading the pawn. Okay, so we'll see how black does that in this game. Okay, so this castles quite natural, and both sides of castle. So here, white would ideally want to play something like this. He would want to play queen e2, rook to d1, rook to c1, bishop to d3, and this is the ideal structure. But currently, he can't play queen e2 because black could just capture the pawn. So instead, he decides to go for this move c1. Which is also quite natural, bringing the rook on the open file. Also, there could be some ideas of lifting the rook later in the game. This is a very natural move, not really committing to anything right now. Yeah, and black goes for a6. So the point of a6 is also quite simple. He just wants to push the pawn to b5, attack the bishop, and develop his own bishop on b7 with tempo. This one. Okay, yeah, no worries. Computer glitch, yeah, fine. So yeah, Black's idea is quite simple. He just wants to push the pawn to b5, attack the bishop, and develop his own bishop on to b7. This is what Black wants to do at the moment. So White plays a prophylactic move. He goes bishop to d3. He just gets out of the way of the pawn push to b5, and the bishop is also very well placed on this diagonal. There is some attacking possibility for White here. So as you can see, White is following up with his plan, and Black is following up with his plan. One, blockade the square on d5, and two, maintain pressure on the d4 pawn. So a6, although it might not look like it does anything to blockade the square on d5, it actually just makes way for the bishop to come to b7 and control the d5 square even more. Yeah. So obviously the pawn on d4 cannot be taken because you just take and there's bishop h7 at the end. Yeah. So in this particular position, Black has many choices. Okay. So can any of you can you guys suggest some choices for Black here? What would you play with Black in this position? Because there's more than one right move. So if you were Black here, what would you play? Okay, so we have h6 and b5. Okay, anything else? There's quite a lot of options for Black here. Yeah. So the main suggestions we have is right now b5 and h6. So both these moves are perfectly fine. So let's look at b5 first. So b5 was not played in the game, but b5 is a perfectly reasonable move. Yeah. So even though it might look like white is winning the pawn with knight takes b5, a takes b5, and rook c6, he can't really